Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. Welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Panel discussion. My name is Heidi Shoop, and I'm president of the Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to introduce our discussion. Tonight we will focus on the events of the last few weeks in the Middle East and what this will mean for U.S. policy. In the past 2 months, in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, Jordan, Libya, and Iran, people have risen up and gone to the streets to protest against their governments. In Tunisia and Egypt, these uprisings have unseated long-time and long unpopular rulers. The inspirational spark for all that followed was provided by the Tunisians, triggered in December by a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire in protest after his cart was seized by police. His anger over lack of opportunity, poverty, and corruption resonated in the Tunisian street and across the Arab world. Within a month, the Tunisian president, who had ruled for 23 years, had fled to Saudi Arabia. The entire revolution was watched on Al Jazeera television and other channels, and followed on Facebook by a new generation of Arabs, young, underemployed, critical of corrupt governmental systems that have not delivered for the majority of their people. On January 25th, tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Cairo. On January 28th, the Day of Rage, in part triggered by another young man, this one named Wael Ghanem, a Google executive, drew even larger crowds, and these were attacked by Egyptian government security forces. There followed a 2-week standoff, which was punctuated by Mr. Mubarak's appointment of a vice president, first one in 30 years, his promises of reforms while defiantly clinging to power, and watched the world over on Jazeera, including, we are told, within the White House, until it seems that sometime after Mr. Mubarak's February 10th television address, the military leadership no longer would support him, and it was quickly announced that he had resigned and that the Supreme Military Council had taken over the reins of government. In my many years as a student of the Middle East and the U.S. interactions with the countries of the area, and particularly of U.S.-Egyptian relations, I cannot remember a time when there was so much excitement, so much anticipation, so much hope for a better tomorrow than there is right now in Egypt and among Egyptians everywhere, and at the same time, so much uncertainty in international capitals about how these events will affect U.S. strategic interests in the area and beyond. To be sure, we are just at the beginning of whatever process is underway, and there can be no doubt that the most difficult problems still lie ahead. But something is happening, and to help us decipher what that may be, and what it bodes for U.S. relations in the region, and what problems are faced by governments in dealing with other governments that do not share common values, and especially when popular uprisings threaten to, or in fact do, sweep away those governments, we have brought together this distinguished panel. They will help us understand the multiplicity of considerations, restrictions, and forces affecting U.S. foreign policy options. The panel will be introduced by our moderator, Stephen Kull. Steve is director of the Program on International Policy Attitudes and the Center of Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland. He is a political psychologist who studies world public opinion on international issues. He directs the PIPA Knowledge Network's poll, which conducts ongoing surveys of the U.S. public, plays a central role in the BBC World Service poll of global opinion, and is directing a major study of social support of anti-American terrorism in Islamic countries. His articles have appeared in numerous foreign policy publications. He co-authored with I.M. Destler Misreading the Public, The Myth of a New Isolationism. His next book, Feeling Betrayed, The Roots of Muslim Anger at America, which will be published by Brookings, will be released next month. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Kull and our distinguished panel. Thank you.
Well, for some decades now, America's relation with regimes in the Arab world has been a source of substantial debate, as you are probably aware. On one hand, U.S. support for autocratic regimes has elicited accusations that the U.S. has violated its democratic ideals and is hypocritical in supporting these regimes. Studies have also shown that American support for these regimes is a significant source of anger among the American public, among the Arab public toward the United States. U.S. support for autocratic regimes in the Muslim world is seen as a kind of betrayal. And because the U.S. has promoted democracy in other parts of the world, but not in the Islamic world, there's a suspicion that U.S. policy is motivated by an anti-Islamic bias. On the other hand, U.S. policy has been defended on several grounds. It's been argued that the region is of such great strategic importance to the world as a whole, as well as to the U.S., that it would be unwise for the U.S. to try to press for democracy in a way that could be destabilizing in the region. Furthermore, if the U.S. were to promote democracy in the region, some have argued that this could lead to the election of Islamist groups that could subsequently suppress democracy and impose an undemocratic system along the lines of the government in Iran. Now, this whole event, this whole argument has really been spun around and is made kind of topsy-turvy by the events of the last few weeks. We have seen that as the publics that have risen up in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and so on, they have been calling for democratic principles, for freedoms. They've been expressing liberal ideas. And this has really changed the situation. It's a new condition for the U.S. So in countries such as Bahrain, Morocco, and Jordan, where there are uprisings, but it's uncertain what the outcome will be, the U.S. has to decide whether to maintain the position that it has had. Also now, with even more importantly, with regimes overturned in Tunisia and Egypt, and possibly other countries, the U.S. has to face some central questions about how to proceed. I think the Obama administration has been somewhat successful in getting, first haltingly, but ultimately out in front of the parade. I think the U.S. will probably get some credit for that, but it has to decide how to position itself relative to the changes that are likely to come. Now, in Egypt, where we really have more information in terms of public opinion, we can see that in the public there are some rather strong liberal tendencies. In a poll we took in Egypt in 2009, an overwhelming 98% agreed with the principle that the will of the people should be the basis of government. And 97% of respondents said that they thought the will of the people should have a greater role in the Egyptian government, somewhat foreshadowing the changes that came later. But at the same time, this is really very important, polls show that the Egyptian public is very receptive to a number of Islamist ideas. 2/3 support the idea that Sharia should be the basis of laws and that Sharia should play a larger role. So clearly there are some people who both embrace these liberal ideas and Islamist ideas. You might say there's a kind of internal clash of civilization within specific Egyptians. And how all these forces are going to play out in the political sphere is really quite unclear. So then the question comes, how should the United States position itself in relation to these processes? Well, in Egypt right now, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood is the most organized force, and it's likely to play a significant role. Now, this raises the question, should the United States seek to support secular parties to counterbalance the Islamist parties? that could very likely create a kind of backlash. People tend to defend what they see as threatened, and since most Egyptians have some Islamist tendencies or some sympathy with Islamist ideas, they could react negatively to that. Should the U.S. support all the parties, including Islamist parties? Would this even be politically viable in the U.S. for the U.S. to do that? Or should it perhaps not so much put emphasis on developing political parties and maybe promote other means of developing civil society? And then there's the question of Israel. It's unlikely that Egypt will withdraw from the peace treaty with Israel in the near term at least, but it is also likely that as public opinion plays a larger role in shaping government policies in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, relations with Israel will probably become somewhat cooler. So how should the U.S. deal with these changes? So these are some of the questions that the U.S. faces and that our speakers tonight will perhaps address. Our first speaker is Dr. Shehata. He will start by giving us a deeper understanding of the events on the ground in the region. And we will hear from Kenneth Wollack of the National Democratic Institute, who will talk about the prospects for democracy in the region and the role the U.S. may play in this process. And then finally, Aaron David Miller will speak to the broader question of how the U.S. can balance its ideals and interests in dealing with this changing environment. So first, Dr. Samer Shehata. He is an assistant professor of Arab politics at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies in the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He teaches courses on Middle East politics and political economy, U.S. policy toward the Middle East, and Egyptian politics and society. He has served as Director of Graduate Studies at New York University and has also taught at Columbia University and American University in Cairo, Egypt. He's published widely on both academic and policy journals, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies and Current History. So, Dr. Shehata.
So what we are witnessing is, I agree, quite remarkable, actually. Very historically significant, not only for the states of Tunisia and Egypt and so on, but the entire Arab world, beyond that, the entire Middle East, and I think it's of great, actually, world historical significance as well. I don't know, certainly I think 1979, the Iranian Revolution, is brought forward as a model or analogy. I don't think that's correct. I don't necessarily think 1989, also in Eastern Europe and so on, is necessarily correct for the simple reason that, unlike Marx's claim that history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce is actually incorrect. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, and these revolutions are different, and Egypt is different than Tunisia, and Libya is different than Egypt, and they will all be different than what we saw in Eastern Europe, and certainly quite different from what we saw in Iran in 1979. But they are, needless to say, incredibly historically significant. This is the first time that we have seen large-scale, nationwide, in the case of Tunisia, Egypt, and other places, massive civilian protests in the face of incredibly repressive authoritarian regimes that have taken them on head-on and have brought down two autocrats who have been in power for a very long time. Mr. Ben Ali for 23 years, Mr. Mubarak for 29 years. The average age of the Egyptian population right now is 26 years, which means that more than half of all Egyptians have only experienced Mr. Mubarak. So it is incredibly significant, I think, and we're also seeing, of course, the ramifications, the implications, the spillover, the contagion of these incredibly inspirational, enabling forces throughout the region. In terms of the underlying causes or the grievances that led to the Tunisian revolution first and then the Egyptian revolution, It's not rocket science. It's quite simple, in fact. There were very long-standing and significant grievances having to do with politics and economics that are the underlying root causes of what we have been seeing and what we're continuing to see. Authoritarianism of the worst kind in many places, autocracy, the deprivation of human dignity in dealings with the state at all levels, from the police that one would see on the streets to petty bureaucrats to the highest government officials, the humiliation that people would face dealing with state institutions and representatives. Authoritarianism, number one. Number two, serious economic issues in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, and in many other places, having to do with high levels of unemployment, having to do with even higher levels of youth unemployment, having to do with, over the last number of years, very significant levels of inflation and income inequality, worsening actually in the last number of years, despite the rosy macroeconomic indicators in some of these countries, as in Egypt, for example, which received the International Financial Corporation's Top Reformer Award 2 years in a row recently, and sustained levels of growth above 6% for a number of years in that period, and recorded record levels of foreign direct investment, whereas at the same time, poverty was increasing, as reported by the IMF. Income inequality was increasing, as reported by the IMF. Corruption was increasing, as reported by Transparency International. And rule of law was deteriorating, as reported by Foreign Policy. So number one, authoritarianism, autocracy, and what goes along with that, the deprivation of dignity and the humiliation that citizens, really not citizens, subjects of these regimes, face on a daily basis. Number two, the serious economic issues that I mentioned. Number three, incredible corruption. Incredible corruption by at all levels, really, but especially at the highest levels of society, the leaders. And then number four, certainly, I think across the region, things vary in some places, but we've also seen incredible poor governance, quite bad governance, really, from Morocco through Egypt and many other countries, Yemen and so on, with some variation, of course. We can talk about whether governance in the United Arab Emirates is a little bit better and so on, but I don't think that really is the big point. So authoritarianism, serious economic issues, corruption, and poor governance. And as I said, Tunisia was really a model. Tunisia and what occurred, as was mentioned, on December the 17th, when Mohammed Bouazizi self-immolated himself, and the subsequent wave of protests that eventually led to the fleeing of Bin Ali on January the 14th. And the waves of peaceful protests throughout Tunisia that eventually led to this in the face of regime repression, that really showed Egyptians and showed many others in the Arab world something. It showed them that what was previously thought impossible, people standing up to an authoritarian regime with armaments and coercion and so on, and bringing it down was really quite possible and doable. And it was incredibly inspirational and enabling. And on the first days of the January 25 protest in Egypt, people were shouting, Tunis, Tunis. إحنا كلنا, we're all Tunisians. And in the communiques that went out to organize the January 25 protests as well, there were messages and there was the explicit kind of recognition that Tunisia was the model, and if the Tunisians can do it, the Egyptians can do it, and so on. Then with regard to some of the other points that were put forward, or the other topics, having to do with the U.S. and whether the U.S. should be pressing for democracy or whether the support for authoritarian regimes was in our short-term interests. I think for quite some time people who are much more eloquent than I have been putting forward the idea that it's not in our short-term or medium-term or long-term interest to support authoritarian regimes. The idea that, you know, he's an SOB, but he's our SOB, is a very bad idea, both for principled reasons, but as also for geostrategic reasons. Certainly things can blow up in your face, as they did in the Iranian case in 1979, when the U.S. had supported the Shah of Iran for quite some time. In fact, you know, helped to orchestrate, along with the British, a coup in 1953 against the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to reinstall the Shah and equip the Shah and train the Shah's secret police. And then, of course, the 1979 revolution took the form that it did, and the tremendous visceral anti-Americanism, quite understandable, was in part a reaction to decades of support for an autocrat who abused his populations with the blessing of the United States. I think that it's certainly not in the short-term or the medium or the long-term interests to support autocrats. I realize that we have all kinds of strategic interests that we have to achieve, and I'm not naive. But I will say one thing. I think we have to be quite specific about this. We have to kind of analytically break down this question. There is a difference between promoting democracy and pressing for democracy, right, and supporting authoritarian regimes. In other words, we can analytically distinguish between those two things, I think. And I think that, you know, before we even get to the question of whether we should push for democratic reforms and so on, and there are all kinds of related questions that are inside that question about American power and how much influence we have and what tools there are to achieve those kinds of things, I would say that rather than having that debate, let's have a debate about what our policies actually are right now. In other words, we need to differentiate between supporting authoritarian regimes, which is what we've been doing for quite some time, and then moving to the separate but possibly related issue of pressing for democracy. So I would say that we don't need to support authoritarian regimes, and in terms of military aid, in terms of economic aid, in terms of diplomatic cover, in terms of visits to the White House and photo opportunities and so on. So that's the first thing I think that needs to be done. And then secondly, with regard to the issue of elections, this idea that, you know, one of the reasons why we shouldn't push for democracy or we should be hesitant about these kinds of things is because if we do have elections in the Middle East, Islamists will win, right? And who knows what those crazed Islamists will do. Well, this is really the myth, the scare tactic that autocrats like Ben Ali of Tunisia and Bouteflika in Algeria and Mr. Mubarak in Egypt have been selling to the West, to Western governments and Western publics for some time. It's either us or those bad Islamists, and we're much better than the bad Islamists. Well, that is and has been exposed as a falsehood. We saw in the Tunisian revolution, we saw that it was a revolution that encompassed large, broad segments of society. And in fact, what was missing in that revolution was the Islamist vanguard. I mean, there weren't, radical Islamists who were behind the Tunisian revolution. Just as in Egypt, what we saw in the January 25 revolution was a broad-based protest movement that included Christians and Muslims, young people and old people, men and women from all across the country of different socioeconomic states and so on. It was not a revolution led by the Muslim Brotherhood or led by Islamist groups. Most segments of Egyptian society wanted to be done with Mr. Mubarak and with the autocratic elements of the regime. Just one last thing. Sometimes even the discourse that we use to describe Islamist politics is problematic. And I don't mean to beat up on you, but the idea of the Islamic tendencies of the people in Egypt or in their, as if it's some kind of a disease, their religion or faith, that somehow inhibits their ability to be democratic. You know, that's not the case at all. I mean, if we look at actually American politics, we'll see that religion plays a tremendously important role in American politics, not just on the right, but throughout American politics. And there should be no fear that that be the case in a place like Egypt or a place like Morocco or Tunisia as well, as long as those states, those polities recognize, universal values of human rights and political rights and civil liberties and so on. With regard to Israel, nothing that we've seen in Tunisia or Egypt or Bahrain or Libya is primarily about Israel, or for that matter, primarily about the United States. They are about domestic issues, about domestic politics, about authoritarian regimes, and about the yearning for political freedom and human rights and dignity in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Bahrain, and in Libya, and so on. So certainly the issues of American interests and so on, whether it has to do with basing rights, for example, or the ability of American aircraft to fly over states, or military cooperation, these things will have to be returned to, renegotiated, and so on. But I'm not afraid in some of the more kind of dire predictions that people in the United States seem to be jumping to, I think, unnecessarily. I've probably exceeded my time. I apologize, and I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ken Wollack, who is president of the National Democratic Institute that promotes democracy in a variety of ways around the world. He travels extensively throughout the world, including the Middle East, in developing the Institute's programs. He has been active in foreign affairs, politics, and journalism since 1972, co-editing the Middle East Policy Survey, as well as writing for the Los Angeles Times, and serving as legislative director for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Currently, he's a member of the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid and has served as chairman of the board of directors of the U.S. Committee for the United Nations Development Program.
The first point I would like to make is, if there were any reservations that the people of the Middle East don't have the same aspirations of those elsewhere in the world, these have been, I hope, if I don't believe, put to rest by the events that we have seen over the last month and a half. We once heard these same arguments about the aspirations of people in Africa that were predisposed to tribalism. We heard these claims about Asian cultures, and in Latin America, again, about a predisposition towards Cadilloism. We have found, not surprisingly, over the past 25 years, that people are in a demanding mood, that they want to put food on the table, and they want to have a political voice in their society. And these are not mutually exclusive propositions. And so therefore, I think the events in the Middle East will only reinforce what has been traditionally a bipartisan ambition in the United States on behalf of democracy and human rights overseas. And I believe it will represent a sea change in attitudes, even in the most realist of circles. And those realist circles were most predominant in the Middle East region. And I remember, it's reminiscent of the changes that took place in the 1980 when two seminal events happened in the Philippines and Chile. And we learned something, I think, extremely important about democratic transitions. And that is that the forces of extremism in these societies enjoyed a symbiotic relationship with each other. It was Pinochet and the communist insurgency, and Ferdinand Marcos and the communist insurgency in the Philippines. And peace and stability ultimately developed when the people of those countries were given an opportunity and when the Democratic center from left to right had an opportunity to provide an alternative to these two extremes. And that Democratic center in both places enjoyed international support. They drew strength and sustenance from international solidarity. What we have witnessed, I believe, in large measure in the Middle East over the past month and a half is a dramatic emergence of a third way, similar to what took place in Latin America and what took place in Asia in the 1980s. And this third way has been reinforced, as Stephen Kull mentioned, over years by successive public opinion surveys and focus groups conducted by NDI, by Stephen, and by others, that the people of the Middle East have a preference for democracy that ranges from a low of about 78% in Yemen and a high of about 92% in Morocco. And it is interesting to note that the protests over electricity rates that erupted last Friday in Morocco were less about the costs of electricity and more about transparency in how rates are set and private bids are managed in the country. The second point I would like to make is that what we are really witnessing is not necessarily a tsunami experience, but rather different changes and demands in each country. Among the more authoritarian states, Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, where the regimes have resisted any change, the demands across the spectrum was to oust the ruling elite and call for the demise of the existing system. Among the so-called slow liberalizers, Morocco, Bahrain, Jordan, Yemen, and arguably Algeria, the reforms cushioned to some degree the response from the population. But all of that could change if these governments, the slow liberalizers, do not recognize that the changes to date are not sufficient and reforms have to accelerate and deepen. The third point I would make is that when we look at the issues that triggered the uprisings in these countries, conventional wisdom have pointed to three developments. First was the youth bulge, which has been referred to before in the region. The second was high rates of unemployment. And the third is information technology, social media, and satellite TV. And yes, all these were extremely important factors. But what emerged during the past decade was largely overlooked or dismissed by policymakers here and elsewhere. The democratic third way did not start last month, and the reformers took advantage of every opportunity to push for more freedom and more accountability from their governments, perhaps in a less dramatic fashion. They were active in legislatures, reformed-oriented political parties, women's organizations, and among the plethora of non-governmental organizations. This was a nascent indigenous democratic network that existed throughout the region. So even in the aftermath of democratic retrenchment in late 2005 and 2006 in Egypt and elsewhere, democratic norms and freedoms were increasingly part of the public discourse. And even where democratic progress was scarce, the language of debate was changing. And in a spirit of bipartisanship, President Bush deserves credit in using his bully pulpit, particularly prior to the invasion of Iraq, which contributed to that debate, as did President Obama's Cairo speech. Outside assistance during this period was not transformational, but provided skills and networks in order for these reformers to recruit constituencies. Fourth, I would just say a word about the youth in the Middle East. Most of the countries in the region drew strength not only from the authoritarian nature of the regime and the symbiotic relationship that they enjoyed with more extremist forces domestically, but they depended on a very insular nature and isolation from the rest of the world. Whereas the younger generation today in the region wants to be part of something larger than themselves. And this was true even in some of the most remote parts of the area. A number of years ago, tribal leaders, many of them young and educated in Yemen, from some of the most remote areas of the world, came to NDI to ask for our assistance in helping to resolve revenge killing in the tribal areas. Now, why would tribal leaders come to an American organization asking for such assistance? But the real reason was that they saw through us a link not only to the rest of the country and to their government, but they saw through us the ability to link to the international community. And I think it reflects an attitude of young people throughout the region. They want to be part of the international community. And finally, I'll make a note about after the flush of their initial victory, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia. Now the efforts must turn to important but seemingly more mundane democratic development issues. Elections, which will be the beginning of the transition process, not the end of the transition process. Will there be a proportional representation system, a majoritarian system, a mixture of the two? How to establish an independent election commission, which has been for elections that have been traditionally run by the Interior Ministry. The monitoring of those elections by domestic and international groups, new voter registration, new media arrangements, a new role for the judiciary, a new role for the police and the military. There has to be efforts to develop at the grassroots new political parties, and there has to be greater activism and advocacy by civil society more broadly. All this normally takes time. In Egypt and Tunisia now, there is very little time before elections that will take place sometime between 6 and 8 months, at least before 2012. People will be in a demanding mood, and the success of the initial phases of the transition in both Egypt and Tunisia will depend in large measure on whether the military in Egypt and the interim government in Tunisia are willing to negotiate a broad agreement with the people of their two countries, with political parties, with civil society, with those who protested. If that dialogue does not happen, and if confidence is not built around what will be a very hotly contested electoral contest in both countries, we will see many of the gains that were made on the streets lost in the negotiating room.
Next, we're going to hear from Aaron David Miller. He's currently a public policy fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He spent the bulk of his career working in the State Department, advising 6 secretaries of state, helping them formulate U.S. policy on the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli peace process. He served as Deputy Special Assistant for Arab-Israel negotiations. and he was a senior member of the State Department's policy planning staff, and he was in the Bureau of Research and Intelligence and in the Office of the Historian. He has been in quite a lot of places. He has written several books, most recently, The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace.
Steve, thanks a lot. To the World Affairs Council, thank you for sponsoring this very timely session. And Samir, it's good seeing you, and Ken, we don't get to discuss and or debate and argue these issues enough. I think one of the hardest things for analysts, policy advisors, let alone policymakers, is to try to determine when things change and what are the consequences of those changes. And there's a great danger for a great power in trying to find the right balance between underreacting to that change and overreacting. I would argue we stand at one of those moments now, and for the great power, there are two transgressions that need to be avoided at such a moment. The first is what I call the sin of omniscience, the notion that we know everything. The other transgression is the sin of omnipotence, the notion that we can do everything. Now, I would argue for the last 16 years, 8 under Bill Clinton, 8 under George W. Bush, our foreign policy in this region has suffered enormously from both of these transgressions. And now, I would argue, if there are lessons to be learned, the time is not for talking so much and or doing. The time is for listening. Now is not the time for ideology. It's not the time for lecturing. It's the time for what I would argue is cruel and unforgiving analysis about the way the world really is, on one hand, and also serious thinking about the way we want the world to be. And in this regard, I would just, unsolicited advice, I give it to myself every morning these days, keep your hopes and your fears under control. Keep your hopes and your fears under control. So in this spirit, I want to make 4 observations in an effort to sharpen the discussion. Number 1, we are witnessing, I'm a historian by training, but it doesn't take a historian to understand this. I don't think you need much perspective either. We're witnessing a transformative moment in the history of this region and in the history of Arab politics. It's an event of enormous consequence, akin to at least 3 Arab-Israeli wars, which produced tremendous reverberation and consequence, 48, 67, and 73. I think Samir's right. It is not to be compared to Tehran in 1979, but the significance of the event certainly is. It is in that respect transformative, and that it occurred without reference to external points, Israel, the United States, makes it even more consequential in my judgment and more transformative. Second, the transformation driven by popular uprisings, whether these are revolutions or not is another matter, and it's worth arguing about it at some point. Are these literally revolvings of the system where the fundamental order changes irrevocably? France in 1789, Russia in 1917, Iran in 1979. Let's call them popular uprisings. Libya actually may well be an example of a revolving. We are in the transformational phase still, but it will at some point give way to what I would describe to you as the transactional phase. The transformational phase will give way and lead to the transactional phase. And that transactional phase will be where popular uprising, aspirations, hopes, energy meet the hard realities of governance, of new political contracts and compacts that will need to be renegotiated in each of these polities, each in their own way. Third, these reformist tendencies will endure because they are based on a dynamic system which is broken, dysfunctional, and driven by rage, aspiration, hopes, and dreams of millions of people. And the fear wall has been broken. Why did this happen? The youth bulge, underemployment, unemployment, corruption, divisions between the haves and the have-nots over resources, divisions between the cans and the cannots, those who can participate in the governance of their societies in these countries and those who cannot. Extractive leaderships who have sucked these states dry for their own purposes. And unlike America, which has its own dysfunctional political system, but it is truly an extraordinary one where, in fact, our system of government is founded on a basic idea. We're the only system of government in the world that is based on an idea. And what is that idea? That idea is the primacy of the individual. Individuals in our society count. Finally, fourth, now what about America? From the small to the broad. Obama played a pretty bad hand, I would argue, pretty well. He talked too much, in my judgment, in the case of the Egyptian crisis. Too many presidential statements, too many daily weather reports about current and changing conditions in Cairo. And on one particular day, it was evident in the remarks of both the CIA director, the DNI, and the president that we were out of touch and out of step with what was actually happening on the streets of Cairo. But by and large, he juggled three balls pretty well. He identified with peaceful, broad-based, non-ideological opposition in the streets of Cairo. He kept America out of the center of the story. It is not our story. We are not the central driver. And he eased a former ally, and I might remind all of us, myself included, that last September at the White House, this man who has now been depicted as an evil, demonic figure by the media, with his billions and billions of dollars, was hosted by the President of the United States with the King of Jordan and the Prime Minister of Israel, and all reports indicated this was an extremely chummy lunch. Jokes, stories, backslapping. He eased the transition of an American ally through a very difficult transition without publicly calling for Hosni Mubarak's ouster, which is, I think, quite important. The question is, can we still juggle the balls? And I don't know the answer to that. I would suggest in the time that remains several points. Number one, our interests, our values, and our policies are all at war and at odds with one another. Our interests, our values, and our policies are not synchronized at all. And with the demise of the autocracies, and with the unwinding of what I call, and since I helped to further it, I know it well, the devil's bargain, with the unwinding of the devil's bargain, the conflict between those three elements, interests, values, and policies, will become clearer and more dysfunctional. And the devil's bargain was quite simple. You support our policies in war and peacemaking, and we will more or less give you a pass when it comes to governance and human rights. Yes, we issued our human rights reports from the Department of State every year, documenting torture, arbitrary arrest, detention, suppression of religious freedoms and practices. And yes, George W. Bush deserves credit for putting freedom on the agenda, but even George W. Bush surrendered to the realities of his own policies in Afghanistan, Iraq, counterterrorism, and the war against al-Qaeda with respect to the freedom agenda. I would argue to you, and I'm not a declinist, I have a great deal of feeling for this country, that synchronizing these interests, policies, and values is not going to be as neat and as clean, or perhaps even as possible as we think. And there are several reasons for this. The devil's bargain is one. The devil's bargain is still maintained. We have interests in Bahrain. We will have interests in the post-Mubarak Egypt. We will have interests in making sure that the Egyptian military provides much-needed stability. I don't know where we're going to come down when the new reformist currents want to take away from the Egyptian military the 10 to 15% of the economy that they control and want their budget submitted to the new parliament. I don't know where we're going to be on that. It's true of Bahrain, and it's true of Yemen, and it's true of Saudi Arabia. Number two, our relationship with the Israelis, which in my judgment will only grow closer as a consequence of the uncertainty and the turmoil that we're witnessing. Our relationship with the Israelis, which is an amalgam of a mixture of our value affinity, our domestic politics, and our interests, all homogenized into quite a remarkable and durable relationship, which in my judgment is unlikely to change. The veto in the Security Council was evidence of that fact. And finally, one other reality. Ken knows very well. We don't control the world. There will always be systems and leaders who will have different values and different political systems than ours. We're not an imperial power, in my judgment. We don't have an imperial class. The Brits exported 30 million of their own citizens during the 300 years of their empire. They like this. People made their careers as a consequence. We have a volunteer army. Most Americans, if it's not terrorism or gas prices being elevated, frankly, are much more concerned, and rightly, I might add, about the current dysfunction within their own house, which is our number one priority and must be. So the notion that we're going to generate billions of dollars for a new economic Marshall Plan to sustain the forces of progressive democracy, it's going to be a very, very difficult stretch. We have to believe that we can do good, and there are any number of ways that we can. But I'll close by borrowing a phrase from Jack Kennedy, the only president who, well, the first and last president who ever had an effect on me emotionally. He described himself as an idealist without illusion. That's where America needs to be. Yes, we need to support and nurture these changes in any way we can, with our economic assistance, with our moral authority, assuming we're respected and admired or will be, and in reconfiguring some of our own relationships with some of our autocratic and authoritarian friends. But we have to do it with our eyes open.
All right, thank you very much. So over here we have a microphone, and we're ready to take questions from the floor.
I just have two questions, if I may. First, I know there wasn't any mention of Twitter, Facebook, any of the social media, and I would think, that part of the agenda perhaps gave these protesters some degree of freedom that they felt and some closeness to democracy, which perhaps added their desire to change things. And just want to know if what you think of it. And the second question is, it seems that the regimes that don't want to kill all their people are the ones that go, and the ones that are willing to, for instance, Libya, which I think in a statement he said he'll go down to the last man, which means have a total slaughter, perhaps would be the one that would survive.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add something with regard to the first part of the question as regarding social media, Twitter, Facebook, SMS, text messaging, blogs, and so on. Now, there's no question that these technologies were incredibly important and have increasingly been important as they've developed. We haven't mentioned satellite television and the ability of stations to project what's going on in Egypt across the Arab world, or Tunisia or Libya, and so on. So I think that you're very correct that they deserve some attention, they deserve some focus, we need to appreciate them, and so on. At the same time, there is this tendency, unfortunately, to fetishize social media and technology, to kind of give them a power somehow independent of people, right? I think a better way of understanding them is to think of them as resources that are available for people to use, to coordinate, to organize, to disseminate information, to kind of further build on their ability to, in this case, kind of challenge regimes. And we can't forget also that regimes also use technology, and it is much more sophisticated than simply turning off the internet. and so on. So my only footnote to the recognition that all of these things have been important is as a kind of warning not to give them some kind of agency that they don't have. It's people who make revolutions, not keyboards or screens. And these things, I think, are better understood as tools or resources to organize, to disseminate information, to coordinate action, and so on, than as causes. I think that's quite important. We've seen a disintegration, really, of the military in Libya. We've seen a number of fighter pilots fly to Malta, refuse to take orders to bomb civilian populations. We've seen the head of the armed forces, I think, declare his, resignation. We've seen naval ships also not willing to take orders with regard to Libya. But the militaries in these different countries are quite different. I mean, in Tunisia, we have a very professional military, small military in size, that was, significantly smaller than the Interior Ministry's repressive forces. In Egypt, the military was neutral to a large extent up until, in the kind of Swiss tradition, really, of not taking sides. And then in the end, I think you're right, forced Mr. Mubarak to leave. In Bahrain, of course, we have a military that is largely not made of Bahrainis, except at the top levels. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were willing, and probably will be willing in the future, maybe, to use tremendous force against a Bahraini population. So I think Mr. Gaddafi's days are numbered.
I would just add, Gaddafi may be left with mercenaries like the Bahrainis. I mean, right now you see a lot of sub-Saharan Africans who are engaged on Libyan soil right now. But I think you are right. If you have authoritarian leaders who are capable to sustain brutality against a population, then they have a distinct advantage. You look at Mugabe in Zimbabwe. He was able to sustain that brutality, and it led to his longevity in power. In terms of, and I agree on the information technology, there is offline activity and online activity, and you need both. And when the Egyptian government shut down the entire system, and 80 million people virtually disappeared, they were still able to organize. They were able to go door to door. So there were organizing skills that transcended information technology in Egypt.
I would just underscore that through these technologies, it really reduces the cost, reduces the risks associated with communicating attitudes and preferences that are negative, and that expedites and speeds up the process by which these consensuses can emerge so suddenly. I think we've all been surprised how rapidly this change happened, and I think that the technology did play a role in that. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for on the part of the World Affairs Council. And thank you all to the speakers for such fine presentations.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.